Moving into the old Victorian house was supposed to be the fresh start I needed. After years of grinding away in a city job I hated, I decided it was time for a change. I used my savings to buy a fixer-upper in a quaint, quiet town. The house had charm, original woodwork, a wraparound porch, and large bay windows that caught the evening light perfectly. It seemed like the dream I'd been chasing. I should have paid more attention to the realtor's eagerness to finalize the sale, or the way the neighbors avoided looking at the house as I moved in. On my first night, the house was still, too still. It felt as though the walls were holding their breath. I chalked it up to being alone in a big empty house for the first time and went to bed early. That was when I first heard the whispers. It was faint at first, almost like the wind. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, it became clearer. Words I couldn't make out, soft and insistent, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I turned on the light, sat up and listened intently. Silence. I told myself it was just the old house settling. It wasn't. By the third day, I was working on some minor repairs. As I stripped the faded wallpaper in the dining room, I noticed something odd. Beneath the paper, the plaster was covered in scratches, long, jagged lines that crisscrossed in every direction. It looked as though someone had clawed at the walls in desperation. I ran my hand over the grooves, unease creeping into my chest. Then I heard it again. The whispering. This time, it was louder and unmistakable, though still unintelligible. I spun around, heart racing, but I was alone. That night, I dreamed of the scratches. In my dream, hands clawed at the walls, skin torn and bleeding, as shadowy figures surrounded me. I woke drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing faintly in my ears. It wasn't until a week later that things escalated. I had just sat down in the living room to watch some TV when a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. I jumped up, heart pounding, and ran to see what had happened. A glass from the dish rack lay shattered on the floor, the shards scattered far too wide for it to have just tipped over. I stood frozen, staring at the mess. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow flitted across the hallway. I turned, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I cleaned up the glass and convinced myself it was nothing. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps pacing upstairs. They were deliberate, each step sending a shiver down my spine. I was alone in the house. Grabbing a flashlight, I mustered the courage to investigate. As I climbed the stairs, the footsteps stopped. The silence was oppressive, as though the house itself was waiting for me to act. I checked every room, every closet, but found nothing. On my way back to bed, a door slammed shut behind me. I turned, but the hallway was empty. That was the first time I felt genuinely afraid. The whispers grew louder over the next few days, becoming a constant presence. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, surrounding me no matter where I went. Sometimes they were frantic, almost pleading. Other times they were mocking, sinister. I began hearing my name, spoken softly, but with a chilling familiarity. One night, as I sat at the dining table, the whispers coalesced into a single guttural voice. "Get out!" The words reverberated through the house, deep and menacing. My chair scraped against the floor as I bolted upright, heart hammering. The air felt heavy, charged with something malevolent. I didn't sleep that night. It was a week later when I saw her. I had just turned off the lights in the living room when I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the window. A woman stood in the corner of the room, her back to me. Her long, dark hair was matted, and her pale skin seemed almost translucent. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my throat felt like it was closing. She didn't move. Instead, her head tilted unnaturally to the side, and she began to turn. I backed away, not wanting to see her face, but my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the couch. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that seemed to stretch too far. And then she was gone. By now, I was terrified to stay in the house, but something compelled me to stay. It was as though the house had sunk its claws into me, refusing to let go. I reached out to the local historical society, hoping to learn more about the property's past. What I found chilled me to my core. The house had belonged to a reclusive family in the 1800s. Rumors of strange rituals and disappearances surrounded them. The family vanished without a trace, leaving behind whispers of curses and blood sacrifice. Armed with this knowledge, I sought help. A friend put me in touch with a local spiritual healer. She was reluctant to enter the house but agreed to perform a cleansing ritual. The healer arrived the next evening carrying bundles of sage and other tools I didn't recognize. As she began the ritual, the house erupted in chaos. The whispers became screams, the walls shook, and a foul stench filled the air. "Keep calm," she instructed, her voice steady despite the cacophony around us. As she chanted, a dark shadow began to form in the corner of the room. It twisted and writhed, taking on an almost human shape before dissipating with a final, bone-chilling scream. When it was over, the house felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. The whispers were gone, and for the first time in weeks, I felt safe. I stayed in the house, though I never truly felt at ease. Every creak of the floorboards or groan of the pipes sent a chill down my spine. But the whispers never returned, and I never saw her again. To this day, I don't know what haunted that house or why it chose me. All I know is that some places are meant to be left alone, their secrets buried with the past. When Jenna and I moved into Hollow Creek Cottage, we were charmed by its rustic appeal. Tucked away at the edge of the woods, the house seemed like the perfect retreat from the chaos of city life. It had a quaint, ivy-covered exterior, creaky wooden floors, and a small brook trickling nearby. The real estate agent mentioned the property had been on the market for a while, but we figured it was just the rural location keeping buyers away. Looking back, there were signs we should have noticed. The way the agent avoided entering certain rooms, the strange burn marks on the kitchen counter, and the heavy, oppressive air in the basement. But we were eager to start a new chapter, so we brushed off any unease. It wasn't long before the cottage began to reveal its secrets. It happened on our third evening. Jenna and I were curled up on the couch, watching an old movie, when a loud crash shattered the quiet. We bolted upright, exchanging startled glances. "The kitchen," I said, already heading toward the noise. The sight stopped me in my tracks. A ceramic plate lay shattered on the floor, shards scattered across the tiles. The cupboard door above the sink was wide open. My first thought was that it must have been poorly latched, but when I reached out to test it, the hinges were stiff and secure. "Did you leave it open?" Jenna asked, standing behind me. "No," I replied, my voice low. I knelt to clean up the mess, trying to shake off the creeping unease. Plates didn't just launch themselves out of cupboards. A few nights later, we woke to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps echoed from the hallway outside our bedroom. I sat up, heart pounding. Jenna clutched my arm, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, slipping out of bed as quietly as I could. Armed with a flashlight, I crept toward the door. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, thick with tension. I checked every room, every closet, but the house was empty except for us. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. The next day I was working in the study when I noticed something odd. Faint, almost imperceptible markings marred the wallpaper. At first I thought it was just wear and tear, but as I looked closer, I realized they were words. "Help me." The phrase was scrawled over and over in tiny, jagged letters, barely visible unless the light hit the wall just right. My stomach turned. I called Jenna in to look, but by the time she arrived, the words had faded, as though they'd never been there. "Maybe you're just tired," she said gently, though her voice trembled. I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd seen. Things escalated quickly after that. The shadows came next, dark, flickering shapes that darted across the walls at night. At first, I thought it was just the play of light from the moon, but they move with an intelligence that chilled me to the core. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the shadows grew bolder. A long, thin silhouette stretched across the floor, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Jenna gasped, clutching my arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the figure as it slithered toward the staircase, vanishing into the darkness. We avoided the basement as much as possible. There was something about it that felt wrong, like the air was heavier down there, suffused with something dark and oppressive. But one night, after another series of crashes and bangs, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I descended the creaky stairs. The smell hit me first. Damp earth and something metallic, like blood. At the bottom, I swept the light across the room. The dirt floor was undisturbed, but the walls. They were covered in deep, jagged scratches, as though something had clawed at the stone in desperation. And in the far corner, a crude symbol was etched into the wall. Its lines burned black into the stone. It looked like some kind of twisted, ancient rune. I backed up the stairs, my heart racing, and slammed the door shut behind me. Jenna found me trembling in the hallway. "We need to leave," I told her. "Something's wrong with this place." The last night in the cottage was the worst. We had decided to pack up and leave the next morning, but it seemed the house had other plans. At around midnight, we woke to the sound of the bedroom door creaking open. Cold air rushed in, and a low, guttural growl filled the room. Jenna clung to me, her nails digging into my arm. "Who's there?" I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. The growling grew louder, accompanied by a scratching noise, like nails dragging across the wooden floor. Suddenly, the bed shook violently, throwing us onto the floor. A deafening roar filled the room, and the air seemed to vibrate with malice. The last thing I remember is the door slamming shut, plunging us into silence. We left Hollow Creek Cottage the next morning, our belongings hastily packed into the car. We never spoke of what happened that night, not to each other, and certainly not to anyone else. Months later, I learned that the house had a dark history. A family had lived there decades ago, and their youngest son had disappeared without a trace. Rumors of strange rituals and ghostly sightings surrounded the property, but nothing was ever proven. Even now, years later, I still dream of that house, of the whispers, the shadows, and the growling that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Some nights I wake up convinced that the shadows have followed me, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I'll never go back to Hollow Creek Cottage. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I hear the growling again. And I wonder if the house is waiting for its next victim. When Hannah and I first saw Ravenswood Manor, it felt like stepping into a dream. The house stood on the edge of a sprawling forest, its grand Victorian architecture bathed in the golden hues of late autumn. It was cheap, suspiciously so, but the realtor assured us the low price was due to the house's age and remote location. We weren't put off by the creaking floors or the faded wallpaper. We were young, in love, and eager to turn the manor into a home. Little did we know, Ravenswood had no intention of letting us live in peace. The first sign came a week after we moved in. Hannah was unpacking boxes in the library while I worked in the kitchen, assembling shelves. She called out suddenly, her voice sharp with panic. "James! Come here now!" I rushed upstairs, finding her standing in the center of the room, pale and trembling. She pointed to the ceiling. Black stains spread across the plaster, veins of dark liquid seeping through the cracks. It looked like old, clotted blood, its pungent metallic scent filling the air. "Did a pipe burst?" she asked, though we both knew it didn't make sense. The stains weren't near any plumbing. We scrubbed the ceiling clean, but the next morning, the stains had returned, darker and larger than before. A few nights later, I woke up to a cold draft sweeping through the bedroom. The window was shut, but the air carried the unmistakable chill of an open grave. I turned to Hannah, expecting her to be asleep, but she wasn't in bed. My heart pounded as I scanned the room. She was standing at the foot of the bed, facing the corner. Her posture was stiff, unnatural, as though something held her in place. "Hannah," I whispered, stepping out of bed. She turned slowly, her eyes wide but unseeing. Her lips moved, whispering something unintelligible. "Who are you talking to?" I asked, dread creeping into my voice. She blinked once and collapsed into my arms, limp and trembling. "I don't know," she said when she came to. "I don't remember getting up." The next day, while I was repairing a window in the dining room, Hannah screamed from upstairs. I bolted up the staircase to find her in the bathroom, standing before the shattered remains of the antique mirror we'd hung just days before. "It just exploded," she stammered, clutching her chest. "I wasn't even near it." The shards lay scattered across the floor, but in the largest piece still clinging to the frame, I saw something chilling. A faint, shadowy figure standing behind us. When I turned, there was nothing there. That night, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind. The old house groaned and creaked in the night, so it wasn't unusual to hear noises. But this was different. The whispers were soft, insistent, and unmistakably human. They came from the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from the very air around us. Hannah heard them too. "They're saying something," she said, pressing her ear to the wall. "James, I think they're calling your name." A week later, I woke in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I stepped into the dark hallway, I froze. A tall, thin figure stood at the end of the hall, its face obscured by shadow. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though sizing me up. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. It didn't move. I fumbled for the light switch, and the bulb flickered to life. The hallway was empty, but I knew what I saw. Hannah and I decided to leave. The house had become unbearable, its oppressive atmosphere suffocating us. We planned to pack up and leave the next morning, but Ravenswood wasn't going to let us go so easily. That night, the house came alive. Doors slammed open and shut. The chandelier in the foyer swayed violently, its crystals shattering against the floor. The whispers turned into screams, shrill and unrelenting. We huddled in the living room, clutching each other as the chaos unfolded. Suddenly the fireplace roared to life, flames leaping higher than they should have been able to. The black stains from the ceiling dripped down the walls, pooling on the floor. And then we saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form twisted and grotesque. Its face was a patchwork of features, multiple eyes, mouths that didn't belong, and a smile that stretched impossibly wide. It pointed at us, its voice a guttural growl. "Get out! My house!" We didn't need to be told twice. We fled that night, leaving everything behind. Months later, I learned that Ravenswood Manor had a dark history. It had been home to a cult that performed unspeakable rituals in the early 1900s. They'd summoned something that never left. Even now, I wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the memories of that house. I don't know if we escaped it entirely. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers in our new home calling my name. Moving to the old McAllister farmhouse was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of city life, my wife Clara and I craved peace and quiet, a place where we could reconnect and escape the stress of our chaotic lives. The farmhouse, sitting on 10 acres of sprawling, untouched land, seemed like the perfect retreat. The first few days were idyllic. The house, though weathered with age, had charm. It creaked in all the ways an old house does, its wooden floors telling tales of the past with each step. We spent our mornings walking the property, our evenings curled up by the fireplace. But the peace didn't last long. The first odd occurrence happened on our third night. I was sitting in the living room, a mug of coffee warming my hands, while Clara was upstairs unpacking. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something, a dark shadow darting across the hallway. "Clara!" I called, setting my mug down. There was no response. I walked to the hallway, the old wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The air felt colder there, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I checked every room, but there was nothing. When I went back to the living room, my mug was gone. I found it later, sitting on the kitchen counter, its contents still steaming. A few nights later, Clara and I were woken by a strange noise. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then it grew louder. "Do you hear that?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded. It was coming from the walls, a soft, insistent whispering. At first, it sounded like static, but as I strained to listen, I could almost make out words. "It's just the wind," I said, trying to convince both of us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The whispers continued over the next few nights, growing more persistent. Then, one evening, Clara called me into the bathroom. "You need to see this," she said, her face pale. She pointed to the large mirror above the sink. In the center, a thin handprint had appeared, smeared as though someone had pressed their fingers against it and dragged them down. We stood there, staring at the print, until Clara whispered, "It's too small to be yours or mine." One night, I woke up to the sound of Clara screaming. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and ran to find her standing at the end of the hallway, staring at the door to the guest bedroom. "What's wrong?" I asked, grabbing her shoulders. She pointed at the door. It slammed shut on its own. And listen! I strained my ears. From behind the door came a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking from the other side. I reached for the handle and twisted. It wouldn't budge. "Who's in there?" I shouted, pressing my ear to the door. The tapping stopped. Suddenly the door flew open, slamming against the wall with enough force to rattle the pictures hanging nearby. The room was empty, but the bedsheets were rumpled, as though someone had been lying there moments before. The final straw came a week later. I was in the basement, organizing some old boxes the previous owners had left behind. Clara had refused to go down there, saying it gave her bad vibes. As I shifted a heavy box off a shelf, I found something odd. A leather-bound journal tucked in the corner, covered in dust. Curious, I opened it. The pages were filled with strange, spidery handwriting, describing rituals and seances held in the house decades ago. One passage caught my eye. The spirits are restless. They whisper their desires in the dark, demanding attention. They are not benevolent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I read. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the basement into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its weak flashlight barely piercing the gloom. That's when I saw them, shadows moving across the walls, their forms humanoid but wrong, twisting and contorting in ways that made my stomach churn. I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. Clara and I decided to leave. Whatever was in that house didn't want us there, and we weren't going to stick around to find out why. We planned to pack up and go the next morning. That night, the house erupted in chaos. Doors slammed open and shut. The walls seemed to vibrate with whispers, now so loud they drowned out our voices. The lights flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. Then, the smell hit us, rotting flesh, thick and nauseating. As we stood in the living room, trying to decide whether to flee immediately, the chandelier above us began to sway. Without warning, it crashed to the floor, sending shards of glass flying. "We have to go!" Clara shouted, grabbing my arm. But before we could move, the front door slammed shut, and the temperature in the room plummeted. From the shadows in the corner, a figure began to emerge. It was tall and skeletal, its face hidden beneath a hood. When it spoke, its voice was a guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Leave," it said. "You are not welcome here." We didn't need to be told twice. We ran for the back door, flinging it open and sprinting into the night. We didn't stop until we were in our car, peeling down the gravel driveway with the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. When we reached the safety of a motel, we collapsed into bed, too exhausted to speak. The next day, I contacted a local historian to learn more about the house. It turned out the McAllister farmhouse had a dark history. In the early 1900s, it had been the site of a séance gone horribly wrong. A medium had attempted to summon the spirits of the dead, but instead unleashed something far darker. We never went back to the house. I heard later that it had been abandoned again, sitting empty, its windows staring out like hollow eyes. Sometimes late at night I still hear whispers, faint and fleeting, as if the shadows followed us. I wonder if we truly escaped, or if the house simply let us go, for now. When Mia and I first saw the property listing for the old Franklin house, we thought it was a dream come true. It sat on a hill overlooking a small town, surrounded by dense woods. It had character, brickwork aged by time, ivy crawling up its walls, and windows that glinted in the sun. The price was shockingly low for such a large house, but the realtor brushed it off as market conditions. We should have known better. Our first night in the house was uneventful, though the silence was unlike anything I'd experienced. In the city, there was always noise, cars, people, something. Here, it was as if the air itself refused to stir. The next day, while unpacking in the living room, Mia frowned. "Do you hear that?" I paused, listening. There it was, faint but unmistakable. It sounded like whispering, coming from upstairs. I set down the box I was holding. "Probably the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. We went upstairs together, the old floorboards groaning under our weight. Each room was empty, and the whispers stopped as soon as we reached the second floor. The first truly inexplicable event happened a week later. We were watching a late-night movie, the glow of the TV flickering across the room. Everything was calm until we heard a loud crash from the kitchen. Mia and I jumped to our feet. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll check," I said, though my own nerves were shot. We walked into the kitchen to find a plate shattered on the floor. It had been sitting securely in the cabinet before, and there was no reason for it to have fallen. Mia crossed her arms. "This house is weird." I nodded but didn't respond. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps. They started faint, coming from the far end of the hallway, but grew louder and closer. Each step deliberate and slow. "Mia," I whispered, shaking her awake. "What is it?" she mumbled, groggy. "Listen." The footsteps stopped just outside our bedroom door. The knob jiggled, then the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Mia screamed, clutching my arm. "What the hell is going on?" I jumped out of bed, yanking the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air felt charged, heavy with something I couldn't explain. The Franklin house had come with a few pieces of furniture left behind by its previous owners. Among them was an ornate music box, which sat on the mantel in the living room. One evening, as we were settling in for dinner, the music box began to play. Its soft, tinny tune echoed through the house, though neither of us had touched it. Mia stared at it, her fork frozen mid-air. "Why is it doing that?" "I don't know," I said, getting up to stop it. The moment I touched the box, the music stopped abruptly. A sense of unease settled over us, and we ate the rest of our meal in silence. Over the next few weeks, the activity worsened. Doors slammed on their own, objects moved from where we'd left them, and shadows darted across the walls at night. One evening, Mia came running into the living room, pale as a sheet. I was in the bathroom, and I don't know what I saw, but there was a face in the mirror. It wasn't mine. I tried to calm her down, but I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that we weren't alone in the house. The turning point came when I decided to investigate the basement. Mia had refused to go down there, saying it gave her the creeps. I couldn't blame her. The basement was damp, cold, and smelled of mildew. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder with each step. At the far end of the basement, I found an old trunk, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. Inside, I found yellowed papers, old deeds, letters, and a small, leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to a man named Samuel Franklin, who had built the house in the early 1900s. The entries started innocently enough, detailing Samuel's plans for the property. But as I read on, the tone shifted. Samuel wrote about hearing voices, seeing figures in the shadows, and feeling watched. The final entry sent chills down my spine. They won't leave. They demand to be acknowledged. This house is theirs now. That night, Mia and I decided we couldn't stay any longer. We were packing our bags when the house seemed to come alive. The walls vibrated with a low, guttural hum. Doors slammed open and shut in rapid succession, and the temperature plummeted. Then we saw it. In the corner of the living room, a shadow began to coalesce. It grew darker and more defined, taking the shape of a tall, faceless figure. Its presence was suffocating, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You need to leave!" Mia screamed. But I couldn't move, frozen in place as the figure began to advance toward us. Its form shimmered, and from its darkness, faces emerged, twisted, screaming, and filled with malice. Somehow, Mia managed to grab my arm and pull me toward the door. We bolted out of the house and into the night, not stopping until we reached the safety of our car. From the driveway, we watched as the lights in the house flickered wildly, and the shadow figure loomed in the front window, watching us leave. We never went back to the Franklin house. A week later, we learned from a local historian that the house had a dark history. Samuel Franklin had vanished mysteriously, and every family that lived there afterward reported strange occurrences before eventually fleeing. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that house, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that shadowy figure and hear the whispers echoing in my mind. When I first laid eyes on the old house, it seemed like an ideal place to start over. Freshly divorced and seeking solitude, I wanted nothing more than to get away from the city and immerse myself in the quiet of the countryside. The house was tucked away at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by towering oaks that blocked most of the sunlight. It had charm: a wraparound porch, a stone chimney, and creaky floorboards that spoke of age and character. I should have known better. The first night was uneventful but oddly unsettling. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of old wood shifting in the night. I'd set up a mattress in the living room since the movers wouldn't arrive until the following morning. As I drifted to sleep, I swore I heard faint whispers, like someone speaking just out of earshot. "Probably the wind," I muttered, pulling the blanket over my head. By the next day, I'd nearly forgotten about the whispers. The movers arrived, and I spent hours unpacking, arranging furniture, and exploring the nooks and crannies of my new home. One feature stood out: a narrow staircase that led to a small, windowless attic. The stairs were odd, steep and narrow, almost as if they hadn't been built for regular use. At the bottom of the staircase was a small locked door. The realtor had told me it led to the crawl space, but I didn't have the key. I figured I'd deal with it later. A week after moving in, things began to happen. It started small. Objects weren't where I left them. A book I'd been reading would vanish, only to turn up in another room. Lights flickered even though the wiring had been inspected before I moved in. One night, as I was finishing dinner, I heard a soft knock. It wasn't at the front door. It was coming from inside the house. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. The knock came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the small, locked door beneath the staircase. My stomach churned as I approached the door, the sound of my own heartbeat drowning out everything else. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I pressed my ear against the wood. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint, raspy whisper. "Let me out." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. Grabbing my phone, I called my brother James, who lived a few hours away. "You're just imagining things," he said when I told him what had happened. "New houses take some getting used to. Pipes creak, Wood settles. It's nothing. I wanted to believe him. The following days brought no relief. At night, I began hearing footsteps pacing above me in the attic. They were slow and deliberate, as though someone was circling the room. One night, I gathered enough courage to check. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under my weight. The attic was empty, but the air was heavy, almost suffocating. As I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, standing at the far end of the room. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The shadow didn't move, didn't respond. It was shapeless, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. I bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. Things grew worse. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the once faint whispers became louder, angrier. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, the bathroom mirror fogged over, despite the room being cold. A single word appeared as if written by an unseen hand. "Leave." The locked door beneath the staircase became a focal point of my dread. It knocked incessantly now, sometimes in the middle of the day. Once, I found deep scratch marks on the wood, as if something inside was trying to claw its way out. The breaking point came 2 weeks after I moved in. I was woken at 3 a.m. by a loud crash. Stumbling out of bed, I found the living room in disarray. The furniture was overturned and my bookshelf lay flat on the floor. And then I saw it. Standing in the center of the room was a shadow. But now it had form, a humanoid shape, towering and menacing. Its head twisted toward me, though it had no features. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as the room grew colder. "Get out!" it hissed, its voice a guttural growl that reverberated through the room. I ran to my car and didn't stop driving until I reached a motel in the next town. The next day, I called a local historian, desperate for answers. What he told me made my blood run cold. The house had been built in the 1800s by a man named Elias Porter. Porter was a recluse, known for his strange experiments and obsession with the occult. Locals suspected he had been involved in dark rituals, and when he disappeared, rumors spread that he'd sealed something, or someone, inside the house. With no other options, I contacted a priest. Father Allen was skeptical at first, but agreed to visit the house. The moment he stepped inside, his demeanor changed. "This place is wrong," he said, clutching his crucifix. He began the cleansing ritual, walking through each room and sprinkling holy water. When he reached the locked door, the knocking started again, louder and more frantic than ever. Father Allen placed his hand on the door and began to pray. The house shook, and an unearthly scream echoed through the walls. The air grew thick with the stench of decay. Finally, the noise stopped. The house fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifted. Father Allen turned to me, his face pale. "It's done, but I'd recommend leaving this place for good." I sold the house a month later, taking a financial loss but regaining my sanity. I never went back, but sometimes in the dead of night, I think I hear faint knocking, as if whatever was in that house wasn't fully gone. The Franklin house, or whatever Elias Porter had summoned there, still haunts my dreams. And I pray no one else ever has to face what I did. When we first found the house, nestled on the edge of the woods, it seemed like the perfect escape. After years of living in the city, Jenny and I wanted peace and quiet. A place to start our lives together, away from the chaos. The house wasn't large, but it had charm. A wraparound porch, a big stone fireplace, and a view of the woods that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The first few weeks were uneventful, filled with unpacking and settling into our new routines. But then, the woods began to speak. It started one crisp evening in late autumn. Jenny was making tea in the kitchen while I sat on the porch, enjoying the view. The air was still, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I heard it, a faint, breathy whisper carried on the breeze. "Come back." I froze, straining my ears. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It was low, insistent, as if someone was just out of sight. "Come back to us." I stood up, peering into the tree line. The woods were thick, the shadows between the trunks deep and impenetrable. "Jenny, did you hear that?" I called out, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "Hear what?" she replied, stepping out with 2 steaming mugs. "The whispering," I said, gesturing toward the woods. She frowned, listening intently. "I don't hear anything. Probably just the wind." I nodded, but the unease lingered. 2 nights later, we were woken by a scratching sound. It was faint at first, almost like an animal pawing at the door, but it grew louder, more frantic. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the front door. Jenny stayed behind me, clutching a kitchen knife. As I opened the door, the scratching stopped. The porch was empty, the night silent except for the chirping of crickets. I shone the flashlight across the yard, but there was no sign of anything, or anyone. When I looked back at the door, I noticed it. Long, deep scratches gouged into the wood, as if made by claws. "Maybe it was a raccoon," Jenny offered, though her voice betrayed her doubt. "Those are too big for a raccoon," I replied, my stomach knotting. Over the following week, things escalated. The whispers returned, more frequent and closer than before. They seemed to echo from every corner of the woods, growing louder at night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we saw them, shadows moving between the trees. They were tall and thin, their shapes unnatural, shifting like smoke. "Do you see that?" Jenny whispered, clutching my arm. I nodded, my mouth dry. The shadows stopped, just beyond the tree line, as if watching us. "Inside, now," I said, pulling her back toward the house. We locked the doors and drew the curtains, but the unease followed us inside. One night, Jenny woke me up, her voice trembling. "Eli, there's someone in the house." I sat up, my heart pounding. "What? Where?" She pointed toward the hallway. Grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand, I crept out of the bedroom. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as I stepped into the dark hallway. That's when I saw her. At the end of the hall stood a woman, her figure shrouded in darkness. Her head was tilted unnaturally to the side, her hair hanging in limp strands over her face. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her head, revealing empty black sockets where her eyes should have been. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only a faint, icy chill in the air. After that, the house became unbearable. Doors slammed shut on their own, and objects moved inexplicably. At night, we heard voices, angry, desperate, whispering in the walls. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, the mirror fogged over despite the room being cold. Slowly, words appeared in the condensation. "Go away." "We have to leave, Eli," Jenny said, her voice shaking. "I know," I replied. "But where would we go? This house is all we have." Desperate for answers, I started digging through the old belongings left in the basement by the previous owners. Among the boxes of junk, I found a journal bound in cracked leather. The entries were written by a man named Thomas, who had lived in the house decades ago. His handwriting grew more frantic with each entry. "The woods are cursed. I hear them calling to me, whispering my name. Something watches us from the shadows." The final entry sent chills down my spine. "She came from the woods tonight. She is inside. I can't stop her." With no other options, we sought help from a local historian, Mrs. Cartwright. She told us about the legend of the Whispering Woods, a place where centuries ago, accused witches were hanged and buried in unmarked graves. "The land is tainted," she said. "If you want to survive, you must perform a cleansing ritual." She gave us instructions: candles, salt, and a prayer to banish restless spirits. That night, we followed her directions, lighting candles in every room and spreading salt across the thresholds. As I recited the prayer, the house shook violently. The whispers turned into screams, and the air grew unbearably cold. The shadows appeared again, this time inside the house, swirling and writhing as if resisting the ritual. "Keep going!" Jenny shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise. With one final shout of the prayer, the shadows exploded into nothingness, leaving the house eerily silent. The next morning, the house felt lighter. The oppressive weight was gone, and the whispers had ceased. We stayed for another month, but the memories of that night haunted us. Eventually, we sold the house and moved back to the city, where the noise of traffic and bustling crowds felt like a comfort. I still dream about the woman in the hallway, her eyeless gaze boring into my soul. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear the faint whispers of the woods calling me back. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to bloody subscribe, or the dream demons might pay you a visit. Sleep tight.